Welcome, dear listener. Let your thoughts slow. Let your breath soften, and imagine yourself now in a land where the sun once kissed domes of red clay and silence flowed like water across marble floors. Tonight, you are walking through the ancient Alhambra, a place where history rests in golden stillness, and every carved archway tells a secret only the wind remembers. It is dusk. The heat of the day has finally loosened its grip, and a gentle, jasmine-scented breeze glides in through the open lattice. You move slowly, barefoot, along the polished stone walkway, each step echoing softly between slender columns of honey-colored stone. Above you, the ceiling is carved like lace from cedarwood, its patterns impossibly delicate, as if frozen in mid. Light from a single oil lamp flickers across the surface, casting slow-moving shadows that dance without sound. The Alhambra was never meant to shout. It whispers, in fountains, in footsteps, in the quiet breath between walls. You pass a courtyard now, the famous Court of the Lions, but tonight it is empty. No visitors, no voices, just the soft gurgling of water trickling from the mouths of marble lions who sit forever in their circle, guarding the quiet heart of the palace. You pause. There is something sacred about the silence here, not the silence of emptiness, but of deep memory, as if the palace is still listening for the rustle of silk robes, the creak of sandalwood doors, the click of a carved wooden screen being pulled aside by unseen hands. You look up. Arabic calligraphy curls along the walls in long, winding prayers, but they do not command. They comfort. Only God is victorious, they say. And beneath this quiet praise, the geometry of heaven unfolds in plaster and tile. Imagine the women who once stood where you now stand, their eyes outlined in kohl, their hair woven with coins or pearls, their voices low, like lullabies carried across courtyards. They lived in the Harem, a place not of exotic fantasy, but of routine and rhythm. It was a world within a world, and within it, emotions moved quietly. Jealousy like a slow tide, longing like a scented letter tucked into the folds of a robe. A servant girl would carry messages by foot, careful not to make a sound, not to disturb the delicate balance of affection and suspicion that hung in the air like incense. The Alhambra heard it all, and though it says nothing, its walls remember. You walk now along the edge of a reflecting pool, so still it seems like a sheet of polished obsidian. The stars above begin to appear, and their faint glow mirrors itself in the water below. A gentle splash breaks the surface, perhaps a bird or a falling petal, and just like that, the illusion ripples and fades. You breathe in. The scent of cypress and rosewood fills your lungs. You are not alone here, not truly. Even now, in this quiet moment, the presence of centuries rests beside you, like a friend sitting just out of sight. Time is different in the Alhambra. It does not rush forward. It folds softly back on itself. Every room opens not just into another space, but into another century. There is no hurry. Even the doors here seem to sigh as they open, releasing nothing but cool air and the scent of memory. You continue, now entering a room where the walls seem to breathe. Every inch is carved, not with pictures, but with patterns, repeated again and again, like a mantra whispered in stone. These walls, they do not speak of battles or conquest. They tell of patience, of craft, of the hands that shaped them, and the lives that passed before them, some with power, some with sorrow, and most with dreams that never left this place. The sound of your own breathing is the only rhythm you hear, and it too becomes part of the palace, a soft thread in the fabric of its memory. You are now near the Mirador, a lookout point that once watched the valley far below, but it is night now, and the view is swallowed in moonlight. Still, you feel the cool breeze from the Sierra Nevada mountains brush your cheek, as if to say, you are part of this story now, however briefly, and perhaps you always were. Here in the Alhambra, time bends like light through stained glass, and even now, long after the last Nasrid Sultan vanished into exile, the palace breathes. Its murmuring walls, its silent courtyards, its darkened fountains still flowing. Everything waits patiently, endlessly, for those who walk slowly enough to hear it. Let your breath match that rhythm. Let your shoulders drop. Let your thoughts drift like petals on the pool. Soon we will enter the next part of this story, where behind lattice and veil, the women of the harem began their day, beneath the whispering sun of Al-Andalus. But for now, stay here a little longer. Let the murmurs of the Alhambra carry you deeper into sleep. Time passed not by clocks, but by the shifting patterns of light, sunbeams carved into filigree as they filtered through the wooden mashrabias settling onto polished floors like golden lace inside the harem of the Alhambra. The outside world faded, not erased, but muffled, as though it belonged to another existence, distant, irrelevant, unreachable. Here, in the Harem al-Andalus, the sacred private space of the home, life moved in quieter dimensions. Each moment was marked not by public proclamation but by gestures, the tilt of a head, the glide of a curtain, the subtle arrangement of fruit in a bowl. This was a world ruled not by swords or laws, but by ritual, by observation, by memory. The day began early, not with the chaos of servants' bells or shouted commands, but with the soft, near-silent murmurs of awakening. First the air changed, cooler now, touched by mountain mist, drifting down from the Sierra Nevada. Then came the sound of water, always water, whether from a fountain hidden deep within a shaded courtyard or poured gently from a ceramic jug into a copper basin. Ablution came first, always, not just washing, but a return to purity. Hands, face, feet, cleansed not hurriedly, but with reverence, a habit taught in girlhood and preserved through generations. The water smelled faintly of rose, or sometimes myrtle. Some women preferred marjoram, believed to cleanse not just the body, but envy from the spirit. They dressed next, layers upon layers, though always airy and light. The climate of Granada required cottons in summer and fine wools when the rains began. Each woman had her own signature. One favored embroidered cuffs with tiny geometric knots. Another had a fondness for green glass beads, shaped like tiny olives, strung on silk thread and worn close to the skin. Their robes, or gilbabs, fell loosely over their ankles, secured at the waist with woven sashes. Silks were common among the favored consorts, dyed with indigo, cochineal and saffron. All produced and traded in the vast networks of the Islamic world. Linger too long near one, you'd notice the scent of ambergris swarmed by the body, or perhaps oud, clinging softly to folds of fabric, or musk, carefully dabbed at the collarbone with a damp fingertip. The harem was never merely a place of confinement. To outsiders, it was spoken of in shadows and misunderstandings, a space of silken idleness, of waiting women, but within the reality was both more complex and more subtle. It was a school, of sorts, where daughters of nobles and slaves alike were taught languages, etiquette, recitation, and embroidery. Some were educated in Arabic, poetry, able to quote Al-Mutanabi or Ibn Hazm by heart. Others learned to play the konan or the oud, their music echoing across the tiled corridors at dusk. In fact, literacy among women of the harem in Al-Andalus was higher than in much of Europe during the same era. Calligraphy was not simply an art for them, it was a whisper of the divine curves of ink, holding entire worlds, and sometimes secrets. It is said that love letters were exchanged between the walls, disguised as lines of religious verse, or folded within embroidered cuffs inked in henna onto the petals of pressed flowers. Relationships formed slowly, layered and folded like the cloth of their robes. Some women shared blood, others shared stories. One would brush the hair of another. Long, careful ritual, often done while seated by an open window, talking not of politics, but of dreams, of birthplaces, of mothers long vanished. Hair was considered a private power, rarely seen by outsiders, its care a form of bonding, a ritual of trust. When not attending lessons, the women wandered the internal courtyards, where orange trees bloomed year-round, and parrots sometimes landed on branches to peer curiously at the quiet, veiled figures below. There were games, chess and backgammon, played on inlaid boards with ivory pieces. There were debates about which spices cured the quickest fevers, and which colors best suited certain skin tones in different lights, and always there was gossip, low and dangerous, like a river beneath a frozen surface. There was joy here, but also grief, slow private griefs, like a cracked teacup placed back on the shelf. Some mourned their children who had been taken from their arms to be raised elsewhere. A prince must be raised among men. Others mourned not being chosen, not being seen in a world where a single glance from the Sultan could change a life. To go unnoticed was a special kind of exile. Even among hundreds, loneliness could be profound, but the women adapted. They carved lives into small spaces, found meaning in miniature things, a well-tended plant, a poem perfected, the shade in a specific spot beneath the jasmine trellis, where the air smelled like old books and the earth after rain. Children often provided the only bridge between the harem and the world outside. Sons were doted upon, dressed in little robes, mimicking their fathers, taught to recite Quranic verses by eunuch tutors. They would dash between the pillars, bringing life and mischief to the still air. The mothers watched them grow, aware that one day these boys would leave to become rulers or soldiers or exiles. Daughters stayed longer. Some were betrothed young. Others trained to replace their mothers, to one day move through the same corridors, reading the same faded verses, asking the same quiet questions at night. And then the evening came. With it came lamps, glass lanterns strung from arched ceilings, casting soft light over everything. The tiles seemed to glow from within, reflecting flickers of orange and gold like sleeping embers. Some women wrote letters. Others retreated to private corners, where memories were stored like treasures. A coin hidden in a pouch, a bundle of dried herbs from a mother's garden, a few strands of baby hair wrapped in silk. One sat alone, plucking a song on a reed flute, her eyes half closed, her rhythm slow, as if playing not to be heard, but simply to remember what silence used to feel like. And all the while the palace listened, the stones, the fountains, the wood. They absorbed everything, every laugh, every sigh, every lullaby half sung into the folds of a pillow, because in the harem history was not carved in stone, it was embroidered in silence. Now the night deepens. The final oil lamp is extinguished, the doors are drawn, the voices fade, and the women sleep, some peacefully, others turning beneath thin blankets, still waiting to be remembered. And you, too, dear listener, may close your eyes now. Let the stillness of this secret world wrap itself around you, like a silk shawl on cool shoulders. You are safe here, hidden in shadow and soft light, drifting quietly into the stories, left behind by those who lived where the world was not allowed to see. There are names carved into stone, and then there are names whispered behind curtains, names not spoken aloud in court, but etched into memory through glances, through the way a hand lingered on a goblet or a scarf was folded a little too carefully. Zoraya was one of those names. She was not born into the palace, nor raised among the tiled courtyards and calligraphied halls of the Alhambra. Her name, before she became Zoraya, was Isabel de Solis, a Christian girl, daughter of a Castilian nobleman, captured during a border raid. One of the many bitter skirmishes along the shifting frontiers of Nasrid, Granada, and Christian Spain. She was young, perhaps 17, taken to Granada as part of a prisoner exchange, but something no one could say exactly what changed her fate. The Sultan saw her muley hasten. Sultan of Granada was a man not easily swayed. He ruled during a time when his kingdom was but a shadow of its former glory, clinging to the last sliver of Al-Andalus as Castile advanced from the north like a slow fire. But even kings are human, and in Isabel, he saw something that made him forget the danger outside the gates. Perhaps it was her eyes, clear, defiant, unreadable, or the way she refused to weep before him, or perhaps it was simply that she was not afraid. He brought her into the palace, and in time made her his concubine, and then, more astonishingly still, his wife. She converted to Islam, took the name Zoraya, meaning Star of Dawn, and just like that, a foreign girl became the most powerful woman in Granada. But power in the harem was never worn like a crown. It was draped in silk and silence, wielded with lowered eyes, and phrases spoken in the right ear at the right moment. Zoraya learned quickly. She learned how to move without drawing attention, and how to speak in a way that left no trace. She learned who could be trusted, and who could be bought with a scent, or a song, or a secret. She surrounded herself with loyal women, two Andalusian sisters who read court poetry, a Persian woman skilled in perfume making, and a mute servant who knew every corridor in the Alhambra. Zoraya's rooms were always fragrant, not just with flowers but with curiosity. Things happened there. Letters arrived and were never seen again. Foreign visitors asked about her, but no one knew what to say. She was a shadow, but one that lengthened with each passing year, of course. The court did not forget the first wife, Aякsa, mother of the Sultan's sons, including the one known as Boabeldil, the last ruler of Muslim Spain. Aякsa had long played the role of the stately consort, intelligent, austere, politically astute. She had cultivated allies among scholars, jurists, generals, while Zoraya, by contrast, held her court among poets, dancers, and dreamers. But poetry, as Aixa learned too late, can be more dangerous than law. The palace split quietly, elegantly, like porcelain, under pressure. Two women, two wings of the harem, two visions for Granada's fading future, and between them a sultan pulled by emotion and lineage alike. Zoraya bore the sultan two sons. This changed everything, for in the world of dynasties, children were more than children. They were stakes, claims, future kings, or leverage in palace games. The birth of her second son was celebrated quietly. No public fanfare, no court announcement, just an extra lantern lit near her chamber that evening, and a dish of sugared almonds passed discreetly among her women. But Aixa knew, and her supporters whispered in the corridors, "Will a foreign woman's child sit on the throne of Al-Andalus?" Lines were drawn, not in battlefields, but in seating arrangements, in whose gift was chosen for the Sultan's name day, in which woman's embroidery adorned the prayer rug in the royal mosque. Zoraya never responded. She did not need to. She waited. She watched. In time, the Sultan grew older, and the court more divided. Zoraya's influence increased. As Muley Hassan aged, he began to favor her counsel, not just in family matters, but in politics. She encouraged him to pursue stronger trade ties with North Africa, to bring Persian architects into the court, to commission a revised edition of Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. She may not have governed directly, but her fingerprints were everywhere. Even the tapestries began to reflect Persian patterns. Even the music in the garden took on foreign notes. Granada was changing, and some blamed her, but Zoraya did not care for their blame. She had other concerns. She wrote letters, long ones in a mix of Arabic and Castilian, to no one knows exactly whom. Some believe she maintained secret correspondence with her brother in Seville. Others believe she was planning her son's escape to Fez, should Granada fall. She kept a map hidden in a book of poetry, its edges worn from handling, its ink touched by oil from her hands. Zoraya may have loved Muley Hassan, or perhaps she only loved survival. No one ever truly knew, not even the Sultan. When the king finally died, Granada fractured. Ahs's son, Boabdil, claimed the throne. Zoraya fled the palace with her own children, disappearing into the winding alleys of the Albaysan, and later, into history. What became of her? Some say she returned to Christianity and remarried. In Castile, others insist she died in Fez, living out her days in a small riad filled with books and silence. But perhaps the truth is less dramatic. Perhaps she faded, a star of dawn swallowed by the bright light of day, leaving only soft traces in the shadows. Today you can walk the halls of the Alhambra, and no plaque will mention her name. But if you stand very still, beneath the arches of the Mirador of Lindaraja, where the water trickles from a fountain shaped like a lion's mouth, you may feel her, in the hush of the air, in the delicate carvings left untouched. Zoraya, who entered as a captive, rose as a queen, and departed like a breath, exhaled into the folds of time now. Dear listener, let your breath match the rhythm of her forgotten rise. Let your thoughts drift like her veils in the wind, and follow the echo of her footsteps into the quiet next chapter of this tale. The rivalry of Queens Aixa and Zoraya's silent war in the Alhambra. No swords were drawn, but battles were still fought, in glances held too long, in silences where words should have lived, in the smallest arrangement of cushions or the placement of a child at the feast table. This is the story of two women, two queens, whose war was never named, but whose choices bent the fate of a dying kingdom. One was Aixa al-Hora, the proud, blue-blooded Nasrid princess, mother of princes, guardian of tradition, a woman born into Granada's noble pulse. The other was Zoraya, the foreigner, the convert, born Isabel de Solis, a Christian girl made queen through desire and destiny to the court. They were rivals, but to each other they were reflections, distorted, wary, unwilling to meet. Aixa had lived most of her life within the Alhambra's walls. She knew every passage, every echo, every soft place where secrets might be spoken. Her father was of royal blood, her mother a respected woman of letters. She was not simply the wife of Muley Hassan, she was his political anchor, his legitimacy, the mother of his heir. Boabdil. When Zoraya arrived, Aixa did not speak her name for months. To do so would be to acknowledge her, to bring her into the folds of court life. And Aixa was too wise for that. Instead, she watched. She noticed how the Sultan smiled a little longer during evening recitations, how new fabrics, softer finer began to appear in the market, how the musicians changed their melodies, subtly shifting from the old Andalusi macomet to newer, foreign scales. Change, she knew, rarely came loudly. It arrived like damp, slow, persistent, and always from below. She strengthened her alliances quietly. The faquis, the legal scholars, still listened to her. She hosted them with olives, honey cakes, and arguments laced in scripture. She sponsored mosques, gifted gold thread to the weavers of Quranic bindings. She recited lines from Al-Ghazali in the women's garden, drawing noble daughters into her gravity. She did not weep when Muley Hassan favored Zoraya, but her eyes grew colder, and her son Boabdil felt the weight of expectation thicken around his shoulders. "You must reclaim what is yours," she told him, but she did not mean just the throne. She meant memory. She meant Granada. Zoraya never responded publicly. She smiled. She retreated. She read Persian poetry by candlelight. She sent gifts to artisans. A bolt of silk here, a rare spice there. No grand gestures. But behind the veil of grace, she built a different kind of court. Her rooms became salons of philosophy. Her allies were not soldiers or scholars. They were messengers, perfume makers, keepers of rhythm, of taste, of mood. She understood something Axa could not bear to believe. That culture, once shifted, was more powerful than laws, and her greatest weapon was patience. The real rivalry crystallized around their children. Axa's son, Boabdil, serious, pious, melancholic. Zoraya's sons, younger, cheerful, more cosmopolitan. One whispered verses in Arabic, the other recited. Hafiz in Andalusi Persian, though the law of succession was clear. Boabdil was the heir. Whispers grew bolder as the Sultan aged. What if the new queen's sons were preferred? What if Granada no longer belonged to the old Nas ways? There were no direct accusations. There were no open threats. But on festival days, when the princes sat side by side, eyes in the court shifted, watching who spoke first, who the Sultan's gaze lingered on, which child carried the poetry in his voice, and through it all the two queens sat still, one in a robe of deep blue, the other in soft gold. They rarely looked at each other, but the space between them was always charged, like silk stretched too tight, the fire in the curtains. At one banquet, a fire broke out, small, controlled, quickly extinguished. It started in a curtain, near Zoraya's chambers. Some said it was nothing, a dropped lamp, a careless servant. Others whispered of Ax's maid seen nearby, of an argument overheard 2 nights before. No evidence, no proof. But Zoraya moved her sons that very night to another part of the palace, and Axa began keeping a blade beneath her pillow. From then on, the two wings of the palace grew more divided. The royal residence became a house split in spirit. Every gesture mattered. Every choice became a move in a game, where the winner would be remembered and the loser erased. As Muley Hassan aged, his rule grew brittle. Christian armies gathered strength in the north. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, pressed deeper into Andalus. Borders shrank, its coffers thinned, and the court began to tremble. Like glassware at the edge of a shaking table, Axa saw her moment. She moved Boabdil's supporters in the army. She bribed the right captains. She stirred the scholars with sermons of purity in return. One cold morning, as doves scattered over the Alhambra, Boabdil declared himself Sultan. Muley Hassan, betrayed by his own blood, was forced into retirement, and Zoraya, with her sons and servants, vanished into the city. Some say Axa was triumphant, but her victory brought no peace. Boabdil's rule was troubled, fragile, marked by defeats and uneasy truces. The Christian armies grew ever closer. Granada would fall within the decade, and with it, all the legacies both women had tried to preserve or remake. Zoraya reappeared only briefly, once during negotiations with Castile, offering counsel in secret. Then she vanished again. Axa remained, standing at her son's side, as he surrendered the keys of Granada to Isabella and Ferdinand in 1492. She is said to have told him that day, "Do not weep like a woman for what you could not defend." As a man, it was the last line in their private war. No tombs bear their names. No statue honors their rivalry, but their echoes linger in the tilework, in the stories whispered by guides in the Alhambra at dusk, in the curves of a staircase where one may have passed the other. Neither speaking. Their war was not of blades, but of memory, and memory, as we've come to learn, is far more enduring than stone. They left no heirs, no bloodlines to carry their names, no monuments to mark their passing, and yet the palace would not have breathed without them. Beyond the veils of power, beneath the tapestries that adorned the inner walls, walked men whose presence was as essential as it was overlooked. They were the eunuchs, the scribes, the poets, the listeners, the carriers of unspoken truth. They did not wear silk, they did not sit at royal tables, they never spoke out of turn, but their footsteps shaped the course of dynasties. Eunuchs lived at the edge of gender, status, and visibility, neither entirely within the masculine world of court, nor admitted fully into the world of women. They were watchers, boundaries incarnate. They were chosen not for what they were, but for what they were. No threat, no lineage, no temptation, only silence. Yet through that silence they came to hold more than most realized. They memorized schedules, managed the pulse of the palace, presided over the rhythm of meals, of prayers, of visits, of rest. A favored eunuch might know more about the sultan's moods than his viziers did, and a dismissed one could destroy an entire house with a single misdelivered sentence. Their rooms were small, lined with ledgers and rolled parchments. Some slept on mats behind curtain walls. Their beds held no softness, but their minds, those were sharpened daily, honed by caution and watchfulness. Information in the palace rarely traveled in straight lines. It flowed like water, adjusting to pressure, finding new channels when blocked. A single movement, the placement of an orange on a tray, a scarf tied twice at the wrist instead of once, a missed footstep was often enough to signal what could never be said aloud. The eunuchs learned this language, in fact. They perfected it. They passed love letters concealed in prayer beads. They delivered warnings written in the margin of ledgers. Sometimes a subtle pause before entering a chamber was all it took to change the fate of a conversation. They lived in perpetual vigilance, not out of fear, but because they knew that power did not lie in being seen, but in being remembered without being noticed. In Andalusi courts, poetry was not ornament, it was architecture. It framed memory, it sculpted emotion, it preserved what marble could not. The poets of the Alhambra were both men and women, but the male poets, especially those without station, played a unique role. They could soothe tensions with metaphor. They could criticize through allegory. A well-placed couplet, wrapped in moonlight, and doves could expose betrayal or mock a rival without ever naming names. Some served as court historians, their verses commissioned to memorialize births, marriages, treaties. Others operated in liminal spaces, reciting in side chambers, offering comfort to concubines through metaphor. When real consolation was forbidden, they were chroniclers of feeling. And in a palace ruled by etiquette and secrecy that made them dangerous, not every servant was what he seemed. Some entered the palace as traders, pilgrims, artisans, and remained as observers. Courts in Cordoba, Cairo, Damascus, and Constantinople often embedded informants into each other's palaces, disguised as cooks, tailors, falconers. Granada was no exception. A certain falcon keeper in the reign of Muley Hassan was said to have spent more time near the Queen's window than with the birds. He took no pay, but received regular parcels from a contact in Almeria. He vanished the day Boabdil claimed the throne. Another man, thought to be a mute herbalist, was discovered to have memorized every visitor's schedule for 3 consecutive years. No one knew who he worked for, or if he ever truly was mute. These were not tales of daggers or poisons, no shadows cast on the stairwell. Their weapons were knowledge and patience. What these men shared was not ambition. They did not seek crowns or coins. They existed in service to the structure itself, its stability, its memory, its ability to endure. Their power lay in knowing what not to say. A eunuch once received a silk robe, a gift from a concubine he had protected from disgrace. He folded it and buried it beneath the floor. To wear it would betray the favor. To display it would expose her secret. Such was the ethic of the unseen. In every court across the Islamic world, from Marrakesh to Samarkand, you would find men like these, keepers of etiquette, gatekeepers of memory, skeletons upon which the grand garments of empire were draped. Their lives were quiet, but their absences were thunderous. If you walked behind one, you'd notice little, perhaps the slight limp, a result of long hours standing, perhaps the neatly clipped beard, trimmed not out of vanity, but habit. He might nod to guards, receive nods back, but never a word. He might stop briefly to adjust a curtain, not because it needed fixing, but because its fold revealed too much to the chamber across the way. You'd see him vanish into a passage unmarked, forgotten, but leading directly to the room of a prince who must be reminded to delay a conversation by an hour. Then you'd hear nothing, only the echo of the wind in the stone lattice and the knowledge that something had just shifted, some danger diverted, some secret preserved, as Granada weakened and Christian forces loomed ever closer. Many of these men disappeared, some fled, others were dismissed by new rulers who did not understand their value. Many were forgotten altogether, but not all. Some remained, converted names, new papers moving through. Christian courts as interpreters, advisors, scribes, the skills of listening, remembering, managing silence. Those were never out of use. In archives of Seville, letters survive written in a precise, unadorned hand from an unnamed servant of the palace, offering diplomatic counsel on matters too delicate for official advisors. The style suggests a eunuch, possibly one from the Nazarite Harem, but there is no signature, just 3 words at the bottom in Arabic: may silence endure. Their stories are not housed in towers or minarets. They do not fill songs, but they endure in the design of thresholds, in the logic of palace etiquette, in the soft spaces where speech ends and understanding begins. The eunuchs, the poets, the spies, the architects of every unseen decision, the ones who ensured that history could unfold without ever needing to say their names. In the Alhambra, secrets did not shout. They were written, pressed into plaster, stitched into robes, whispered onto parchment, and tucked inside locked chests. This was not the world of proclamations and banners. This was the world of subtle marks and symbols, where the difference between loyalty and treason could be found in the curve of a letter or the shade of a stitched thread. An empire written in ink. The Nazarite dynasty believed in the power of words, not merely spoken words, but preserved ones. Their scribes were craftsmen of meaning. Each letter was shaped with intention. Each line followed a geometry of thought. Ink was not simply a medium, it was a material of authority, a currency of legitimacy. An official letter might take days to prepare, not because of the message, but because of how that message had to be written. The paper had to be smooth, the ink had to sit cleanly on the surface, and the script had to reflect the status of the sender. Royal scribes wrote with reed pens, dipped in ink made from soot, gum, and water. The best ink glided without resistance, cool, dark, permanent, and yet the most meaningful lines were often the ones never meant for anyone to see. A palace covered in script. Walk the Alhambra, and you'll see it almost everywhere. Inscriptions, wrapped around doorways, stitched into the borders of ceilings, resting like lace along the sides of fountains. Some are blessings. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. Others are slogans. There is no conqueror but God, repeated dozens, even hundreds of times in every chamber, every corridor. But among these verses, some are not immediately recognizable. They are fragmented, cut short, placed in odd corners. Why would a holy verse begin halfway along a window frame? Why would a line of poetry be carved upside down? Because not all inscriptions were made for everyone. Some were personal, some were private jokes, some were hidden warnings, others were declarations disguised as decoration. One set of lines, located deep in a garden alcove, contains no religious verse at all, just a poem describing a dove flying home with torn feathers. No one today knows who commissioned it, but the timing, when matched with known palace records, coincides with the quiet disappearance of a favored concubine. It wasn't coincidence, it was coded grief. The calligraphers behind the walls, court calligraphers, held delicate roles. They were not nobles, but they carried knowledge that could destroy a noble's future. Many were chosen from schools in Fez or Cairo, trained not only in penmanship, but in ethics, or rather, in restraint. Their loyalty was tested repeatedly, their silence more valuable than gold. A single calligrapher might handle the Sultan's correspondence, his marriage contracts, his poetry, and his confessions. They were often expected to memorize what they transcribed. If caught revealing contents, they could lose not just their positions, but their tongues. And yet, some still found ways to speak between the lines. Margins were fertile ground. So were ink choices, spacing, the use of unusual characters. A calligrapher sympathetic to a dismissed official might exaggerate a curve, or introduce a slight break in a word, just enough for someone to notice that something was off. Hidden messages in cloth and thread. When women of the harem wanted to speak, they found their own methods. Paper was not always permitted. Parchment might be inspected, but cloth was everywhere. Embroidery was seen as harmless, a domestic craft, but in truth, it became one of the most subversive languages inside the palace. patterns could be symbolic. A row of stars with one missing might signify exile. A repeated pomegranate shape, fertility or loyalty or bloodline. It depended on the color dot. Letters could be hidden in floral designs. Tiny Arabic characters worked into leaves, stems, vines. To an untrained eye, it was decoration. To the intended reader, it was a message. Some women stitched prayers for the return of lost sons. Others stitched pleas to the Sultan into the hems of ceremonial robes. A single robe, now faded and hidden in a museum archive, features an embroidered quote from a famous poet. The bird sings even when its wings are broken. It was traced in gold thread into the cuff of a young concubine's sleeve. She had not been seen for months before the robe appeared. Love letters, that disguised rebellion letters, were sometimes written, but rarely in the form one would expect. Instead of scrolls, messages could be folded into fans, woven into the lining of slippers, or encoded into verse, with metaphors standing in for names. Events cloaked in metaphysical imagery. One legend speaks of a eunuch who carried an innocuous poem from one concubine to another. The poem appeared to be about the moon, but when the final word of each line was read aloud, it formed a sentence. Do not trust the blue-eyed god. He is theirs. The poem was destroyed after delivery, but the concubine who received it never entered the garden again on Thursdays, the day the blue-eyed god worked the outer gate. Ink, as where writing, in all its forms, served not just to communicate in the moment, but to preserve what others tried to erase. Many women had no voice. In court, no official record, no legal defense, but they had the needle, the stylus, the memory dot. They wrote for their future selves, for the hope that someone, someday, would look at their stitches, their ink, their strange alignments on a page, and understand dot in a world where names could be removed from records, where titles could be stripped in a single day. Writing was survival dot. Not all of it lasted. The moisture of centuries has dissolved much. Fires, mold, neglect, they have taken their share, but some survives dot in the faint lines beneath a mirror frame, in a letter found tucked between the pages of a forgotten religious text, in a tear, in a robe where thread had been unpicked carefully, precisely, perhaps to remove something only the wearer and the writer were meant to know dot. This was not just art, it was agency dot, and the palace, for all its grandeur and its watchful eyes, could never fully contain it. Even in the quietest corners, even in the most restricted rooms, writing found a way. And still, not everything could be written. Some emotions escaped even the quietest ink. Some truths lived not in verses, but in glances shared across lantern-lit courtyards, in footsteps that echoed after the last call to prayer, in breaths held just a moment too long beneath a veil of silence, because in the Alhambra, nightfall brought its own kind of language, one that didn't need calligraphy or thread. When the lamps were dimmed and the palace exhaled its last breath of ceremony, a new rhythm began, unrecorded, unspoken, but deeply felt. Let us follow it now, into the still corridors, out onto the gravel paths, and into the moonlit gardens, where secrets moved more freely, and the hearts behind the veils finally had room to beat. Asterisk night in the Alhambra was not silent. It breathed, it creaked in the cedar beams, it echoed in the soft splash of fountains that never slept. It moved between the carved screens and open terraces like a cautious guest, unseen but deeply present. For many in the palace, day brought structure, schedules, etiquette, expectation, but night belonged to no one. And in that absence of obligation, a different kind of life emerged. When the palace dimmed after the final prayers were whispered and the evening meal had passed, the Alhambra transformed. Torches were extinguished in the main halls, the courtyards emptied, servants retreated to the lower levels. The rhythm of the palace slowed, its breathing softened. The women of the harem, once confined by routine, now moved in looser ways. They stepped out from behind their embroidered curtains. They shed the outermost layers of their garments. They leaned on stone balconies and gazed into the vast, dark valley beyond the walls. Some stayed in their rooms, their lamps turned low. Others moved quietly through the corridors, bare feet making no sound on the polished floor. It was not rebellion, it was release. The gardens at night of all the spaces in the palace, the Generalife gardens were the most alluring after dark. During the day, they were reserved for the Sultan and his court, a display of cultivated power and artistic perfection. But at night, the boundaries relaxed. The air was cooler. The scent of orange blossoms thickened. The still water in the reflecting pools mirrored the moon and nothing else. Women would walk the gravel paths, alone or in pairs. No words exchanged, no destination in mind, just steps. That it was in the garden where secrets were born, not always political ones, but personal, emotional. Here in the quiet glow of starlight, long-held frustrations were spoken, private questions were voiced. Laughter, when it came, was low and real. Unspoken relationships. The harem was not built for intimacy. It was built for control. But humans are not so easily managed, and in the stillness of the night, relationships that had no place in the daylight found a way to exist. Not all were romantic. Some were rooted in deep companionship, formed between women who shared a history, a loss, a room. But some were romantic. A favored maid might spend every evening beside the same concubine, reading her verses from an old poetry scroll, not for entertainment, but for closeness. A eunuch, trusted by the women, might sit across from a lady of the court, sharing bread and quiet glances under the pretense of delivering a message late at night. One pair of women was known to walk the upper terrace every third night, always returning just before the call to morning prayer. Nothing was ever confirmed. Nothing was ever questioned. The night was a kind of permission that the daylight refused to offer. Letters delivered after dusk if a message was too sensitive to pass in daylight. It waited for the dark. There were systems for this. A folded scarf tied around a certain column, a ceramic cup turned upside down in a particular courtyard. These were signals a message was ready or had been delivered. Eunuchs acted as intermediaries. Trusted maids became couriers. Some letters were wrapped in dried lavender to mask the smell of ink. Others were memorized and burned. The content varied: a note from a concubine to the sultan, pleading for his attention, a warning to a woman being watched, or, more commonly, a line of poetry shared from one woman to another. Always careful, always deliberate. If discovered, the punishment could be severe, but most never were, because the night protected its own. The risk of being seen despite the peace of moonlight, there was always danger. The guards never truly slept. Some eunuchs were loyal to different masters. Walls in the Alhambra had a habit of listening. One concubine, known for her beauty, was caught wandering near the garden steps one evening, a place she was forbidden to go. She was not beaten, she was not exiled, but her window was sealed shut. The next morning, and her visits to the garden ceased. Another woman was simply reassigned, moved 2 quarters deeper in the palace, farther from the breeze, farther from the view. Sometimes, punishment didn't come as a strike. It came as isolation. Which, in the harem, was often worse. When the sultan walked alone, the sultan himself was not immune to the allure of night. On rare evenings, he walked the outer gardens unaccompanied, hooded, silent, his steps purposeful, but slow. He rarely spoke. Sometimes he paused near the marble fountain, its flow echoing faintly through the sleeping palace. It was understood those nights were not to be interrupted, but some said that once concubine stepped into his path, intentionally or not, she offered him a date from her sleeve, a fruit picked early from the garden. He accepted. He did not speak, and she was later moved to his private wing. True or not, the story lingered. It was repeated in low voices, not as fact, but as possibility. And in the palace, possibility had power. Sleep, interrupted and shared, despite the constraints of life behind walls. Sleep was rarely solitary. Rooms were shared. Beds often were too. Women slept in pairs or in groups, not because they had to, but because it eased the edges of their confinement. A shared pillow, a hand brushed in the dark, a soft voice whispering something half remembered from childhood. The night, more than any tutor or sermon, taught them how to live with one another. It was not always peaceful. Some cried, some kept secrets, some dreamed of escape, but together, in the darkness, they felt human in a way the daytime rarely allowed. The morning that followed eventually, the darkness would shift, not all at once, but slowly, the moon fading, the air warming, the walls beginning to glow. The palace, still quiet, would begin to reassemble itself. Maidservants returned to their duties. The torches were relit, the perfume burners placed near the baths. Everything went back into place, but traces of the night remained in the sleepiness of the women's eyes, in the faint imprint on a garden bench, in the scent of flowers still heavy on the wind. The palace would never speak of what happened after dusk, but it remembered, and so did they. Asterisk. Night offered them a kind of freedom, a temporary release. In the dark, behind the shelter of walls and under the hush of stars, the women of the harem could feel something close to possibility. But the night was always short, and when the light returned, so too did the weight of the world beyond the palace. Because outside the tiled courtyards and jasmine-scented gardens, a different story was unfolding, one that could not be quieted by routine or hidden behind silkscreens. The same palace that gave shelter to whispered secrets was also at the center of something far greater, the final, slow unraveling of an empire. Let us turn now from the private lives behind carved doors to the slow, silent collapse that reshaped everything they had known. Asterisk. The Nasrid dynasty did not fall in a single battle. Its collapse was not marked by the sound of walls crumbling or armies storming the gates. It was slower than that, more delicate. A series of cracks that deepened quietly across decades, in loyalty, in morale, in memory. And for those who lived within the walls of the Alhambra, the end came not as a clash, but as a sigh. By the late 15th century, Granada stood as the last remaining Muslim kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. For centuries, Islamic Al-Andalus had thrived, producing scholars, physicians, poets, and architects whose work had reshaped the world. But now, the brilliance of Cordoba had faded, Seville had long been conquered, and only Granada remained a glimmer of the past, flickering against the growing pressure of Castile and Aragon's united Christian crown. Inside the Alhambra, life carried on much as it always had. Gardens were tended, meals were prepared, lessons were taught, poems were recited. But outside, the world had changed, and inside, people knew it. The Sultan Muley Hassan had once been strong. He ruled with authority, balancing diplomacy with defense, struggling to hold the boundaries of the kingdom intact, while rival Christian forces grew increasingly unified. But as he aged, so did the fabric of his rule. The court became divided, not only by politics, but by affection. The rivalry between his two wives Aixa and Zoraya had, by now, become legend within the walls. It was never spoken of openly, but it was there reflected in every decision, every favor granted, every change in appointment. Aixa's son, Muhammad XII, better known as Boabdil, had declared himself sultan while his father still sat on the throne. This internal fracture weakened the very heart of Nasrid power. Granada became a kingdom with two sultans, and in effect, no true center. Supporters of Aixa, including many within the army and the scholarly elite, rallied behind Boabdil. Zoraya and her allies, mostly the urban merchant class and cultural factions tied to the Sultan, resisted. What unfolded was not a civil war in the open sense, but a series of political withdrawals. Alliances frayed, loyalists changed sides. Even the eunuchs in the palace began to subtly shift their routines, no longer certain who truly held power. Outside the gates, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon saw opportunity. They had already begun the centuries-long campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula for Christianity, and Granada, weakened by division and isolated diplomatically, stood as the final jewel to be taken. In 1482, Boabdil was captured by Christian forces during a skirmish. He was not executed. Instead, Isabella and Ferdinand did something clever. They released him. They offered him a deal: become a vassal ruler under Christian authority, or lose everything. He accepted and returned to Granada, claiming legitimacy through both lineage and new Christian backing. But in doing so, he lost the trust of many who had once seen him as the defender of Islam in Iberia. Muley Hassan died in obscurity. Zoraya disappeared from records shortly after. Aixa remained, her influence intact, watching her son compromise what her ancestors had once built. Within the palace, these shifts were felt acutely, even if not fully understood. The women of the harem noticed fewer deliveries from distant provinces. Embassies from North Africa, once frequent, had stopped arriving. The guards became fewer in number. Feasts became smaller. The flow of perfumes and silks diminished, replaced by more local goods, more practical, less luxurious. One chamberlain, once responsible for overseeing 4 dozen rooms, was now assigned to only 6. The music changed. Songs once sung with laughter were now performed with formality, as if meant more to remember joy than to evoke it. Stories reached the women in fragments, that Christian cannons were approaching, that the towns of Lod and Malaga had fallen. That surrender was being discussed, not as if, but when. There was fear, yes, but more than that, there was resignation that the Alhambra, for all its glory, was not built to withstand siege. Its beauty had never been about defense, but about expression, about the idea that harmony could be made visible. Its tiles, its domes, its arabesques, these were symbols of faith in something larger, something divine. Now, that faith was fading. In 1491, as negotiations for surrender intensified, Christian envoys were invited into the palace itself. For the first time, they walked the corridors. They stood in the throne room. They drank water from the fountains that had once been reserved for the Nasrid elite. Boabdil, weary and cornered, agreed to terms. On January 2nd, 1492, he handed over the keys of Granada to Ferdinand and Isabella. The ceremony was formal, public, and devastating. Ayexo was said to have accompanied her son to the gates. According to legend, as he turned to gaze back at the city, his eyes filled with tears. "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." His mother told him. That moment became etched in Spain's history. But inside the Alhambra, the surrender felt different. There was no grand collapse, no violence, no looting. Instead, the palace began to empty. Rooms were closed, fountains slowed, scripts on the walls, once bright with intention, dimmed under the dust of neglect. Some women fled, others were married into Christian households. A few remained for a time, servants, caretakers, relics of a forgotten court. The poetry stopped, the letters ceased, the gardens grew wild around the edges, and the palace, once a world unto itself, became a memory wrapped in silence. Yet even in its fading, the Alhambra did not vanish. Its architecture was preserved, admired even by its conquerors. Its design inspired awe, even in those who didn't understand the language it was built in. And while the dynasty fell, its rulers exiled, its line broken, its story lived on in plaster and stone, in the quiet beauty of geometry, in the inscriptions no one could quite erase, because while empires may fall through force, what lingers are the patterns, the verses, the moments of human life that passed, unwritten but not forgotten. When the palace emptied, it did so without ceremony. There was no procession, no final curtain drawn, no inscription carved to mark the exit of the women who had lived for years, sometimes lifetimes, inside its walls. For most of them, there would be no return, and for many, no record that they had ever been there at all. They did not take statues, banners, or gold with them. They took only what they could carry: a small chest, a familiar shawl, perhaps a child. The rest, memories, relationships, quiet defiance, was left behind, buried not in soil, but in space. In rooms where curtains once fluttered, in courtyards where voices once rose in laughter and rivalry, in gardens whose trees continued to bloom, long after their caretakers were gone. The Alhambra had been a world built around them, and yet history rarely remembers their names. The nameless majority, the Nasrid dynasty, kept meticulous records of royal lineage, treaties, and property. But the women of the harem, except for a select few, like Zoraya or Aixa, were recorded in passing, if at all. Many of them were brought from distant lands, captured in raids, gifted in diplomatic arrangements, or born into service. Some were daughters of noble houses in Fez, Cairo, or Tunis. Others were taken as young girls from Christian territories, converted, renamed, and absorbed into the palace, without trace. By the time the Christian monarchs entered Granada in 1492, the vast majority of these women had already been displaced. Some were quietly escorted away, delivered to safe houses in the Albaycin or the outskirts of the city. Others were absorbed into noble Spanish households as maids, nannies, or curiosities of the Moorish court. For them, the fall of Granada wasn't a political shift. It was a severing, a life interrupted. And because they had no land to claim, no voice in court, no sons with official titles, they slipped through the cracks of recorded history like sand through fingers, but not through memory. Echoes in the domestic world. If we want to understand what they left behind, we have to look beyond chronicles. We look instead at customs that outlived the court. The ways meals were prepared slowly with care, layered spices and preserved citrus, still practiced. In parts of southern Spain, Morocco, and Algeria, the use of orange blossom water in linens, the call to prayer spoken in private homes, not for obligation, but for rhythm. Even in Christianized Granada, centuries after the fall, Visiting travelers noted that many of the local women used copper mirrors, painted their hands with henna, and washed their hair with mixtures of herbs and clay, habits inherited, quietly, from the women of the palace. None of this was declared. There were no claims to origin, but the influence remained. Culture rarely vanishes. It folds itself into daily life, into how a mother sings to her child, into how bread is shaped, into what is remembered and never explained. Objects without names, some physical traces survived, though disconnected from their creators, in private collections and museum vaults. There are objects labeled simply as Nazrid, a ceramic lamp inscribed with a line of poetry, a silk sash with an unusual stitch along the hem, a small brass box containing dried rose petals and handwritten lines, now faded to near invisibility. Who made them? Who wore them? Who folded the paper? No one knows. They are catalogued as artifacts, but they were once intimate possessions held, smelled, worn, hidden. One comb, carved from ivory and found behind a plaster wall during restoration, was traced by stylistic detail to the late 15th century. Its teeth were broken, its design simple 3 vines. One severed. Was it symbolic? Was it personal? We can't know. But in its smallness, it becomes immense. A direct line to a woman whose name no longer exists, but whose hands once ran that comb through her hair before stepping into a courtyard, now open to tourists. Memory through exile. Memory took different forms. Many women who fled to North Africa carried their knowledge with them. They became grandmothers, teachers, caretakers of fading traditions. They taught new generations how to grind spices the old way, how to fold a scarf to signal a message, how to blend rose and clove to treat fever, how to sit in silence when you're being watched, and how to speak without speaking when the moment is safe. Even when they did not speak of the Alhambra directly, they taught it. A woman in Fez, a century later, might prepare a wedding bath for her daughter using methods passed down not from books, but from memory. A lullaby sung in Tituine carries lines that appear, word for word, in a poem etched into the Alhambra's northern wall. These were not coincidences. They were inheritances without documentation, and they are just as real as any signature on a royal decree. What was lost, what was kept, we will never recover the full stories. We will never know how many lives began and ended behind those lattice windows. I don't know how many friendships ended in bitterness, how many nights were spent in secret joy, how many acts of resistance were never discovered, never punished, never spoken of again. But we do know this. The women of the harem lived fully. They felt betrayal, love, disappointment, ambition, hope. They dreamed of escape. They laughed at small things. They clung to the only things that were theirs, their bodies, their language, their relationships, and even though they were locked inside a world built for containment, they shaped it from within, in architecture, in scent, in rhythm, in silence. That is what they left behind. There is a kind of grief that history doesn't know how to record. Not the grief of war or conquest, but the quiet grief of vanishing without recognition, of leaving behind entire lifetimes filled with emotion, knowledge, and experience, only for them to dissolve into the air as if they had never existed. This is the grief that surrounds the women of the Alhambra. They lived full lives behind those intricate screens, made choices, took risks, loved deeply, and suffered quietly. And yet the historical silence around them has created a kind of phantom absence, so wide it can still be felt in the corners of the palace, where light hits the tile just so, and the air seems to pause. It is not just the lack of names, it is the lack of knowing who they were beyond the roles assigned to them. Wife, concubine, daughter, servant. Each of them was more than that, and that fullness, denied space in history, lingers in the building like perfume long faded, but never truly gone. What stories were never told because no one asked? What truths died with the women who weren't permitted to write them down? In cultures where female modesty was prized and public voice discouraged, many women developed ways to encode their experiences in things that would not be preserved: spoken words, gestures, glances. They adapted to a world that did not listen to them by cultivating a kind of internal storytelling, passed through families in phrases that never made it into books. Even centuries later, remnants of these voices exist in curious turns of speech, in prayers said at dusk, in practices still preserved in remote villages by women who never knew their origins. It's possible that the women of the harem intended it this way. that they created a private legacy for other women, not for kings or chroniclers, but for daughters and granddaughters who would inherit the silence and understand it. In a very real way, the Alhambra itself became their monument, not through statues or tombs, but through the very structure of the space. Its courtyards, its rooms, its patterns, they were not made solely for grandeur, they were made for daily life, for moving through the world with grace and control, even when confined. The way light enters a certain room, soft and warm at mid-morning, perhaps it was designed for a woman to pray or read there in solitude. The latticework, allowing vision outward but not inward, gave the women power of perspective, even in their seclusion. The entire palace is infused with their presence, their daily decisions, their emotional footprints edged invisibly, but enduring. When you walk through it now, you're walking through their lives. There's a kind of injustice in how quietly their legacy endured. While the names of kings are preserved in ledgers and painted portraits, the women who dressed them, advised them in bedchambers, bore their children, calmed their tempers, and shaped their domestic worlds. Those women vanished from view, but their influence did not vanish. It moved sideways. It reshaped the court culture of Morocco, of the Ottoman Empire, of southern Spain. It slipped into language and behavior, into the way diplomacy was performed at tables, into architecture designed for harmony and beauty. Their power was not loud, but it was lasting. And though they may have died without monuments, they are still speaking to us in the spaces they once filled, and the silences they left behind. The Alhambra still stands. More than 5 centuries have passed since the women left its chambers, since the last prayer echoed off its tiles in Arabic, since the gates were surrendered to Christian hands, but the palace remains, silent, dignified, enduring. It does not shout its past, it does not protest what it has lost. It simply continues to exist, as if waiting for someone who remembers what it once meant to live there, and perhaps that is what makes it feel so much like a dream built in stone, a world that should have vanished, but didn't. Today, visitors walk its halls, gaze up at ceilings carved like woven silk, dip their hands into fountains that still run with cold mountain water. They take photographs, they whisper in awe, they follow the light as it moves through the latticework, not realizing that they're walking through a place meant to be experienced in stillness, because the Alhambra was never only about its architecture, it was always about presence, about how it made its people feel safe, seen, confined, cherished, forgotten. And though the names of the women have faded, their touch remains in the softened threshold, stones in the patterns that repeat like remembered songs, in the rooms where silence feels somehow alive. They were never meant to be forgotten. They were simply not recorded, but they are here, in every curve of calligraphy, in every carved petal, in every space where nothing was said, because everything was already known. At dusk, when the palace empties and the last tourists leave, the Alhambra exhales, the light fades over the red stone of its outer walls. The fountains continue to murmur, just as they did when the palace held secrets and rivalries, when women leaned into one another to whisper truths they couldn't say aloud. You can imagine them still, a figure passing behind a curtain, a headscarf tied in a specific way, the scent of warm saffron or crushed mint, moments that meant nothing to history books, but everything to those who lived them. They are not ghosts, they are not stories, they were people, and for a time this palace was their whole world, a world of beauty and pressure, of ritual and risk, of deep friendships and carefully buried grief. There are places in the Alhambra where sound behaves differently, corners where a single footstep echoes longer than expected, where the flutter of a bird's wings seems to linger in the air, where silence feels layered, as if generations have piled up within it. Historians might explain this as acoustics, as clever architectural design, but for those who stand there without rushing, without reaching for explanation, it feels like something more. It feels like memory, suspended in space, like an invisible thread connecting you to someone who once stood exactly where you're standing, with the same sunlight on their face, asking the same quiet